Attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, this is Wayne Callan for Attitude Magazine, and welcome to today's webinar. Today's topic, Drive Safely, ADHD Teens and Young Adults Behind the Wheel, is a challenge all parents want their kids to meet. The articles and studies on ADHDers who drive are eye-opening, serious, and scary. Anything we can do to limit the dangers of driving for our teens will give us peace of mind that they are driving more safely. We are very fortunate to have Wes Crenshaw with us to help us out. Wes is a Kansas City metro psychologist and author of I Always Want to Be Where I'm Not, Successful Living with ADD and ADHD. He's also author of Dear Dr. Wes, Real Life Advice for Teens. He is a frequent guest on radio and TV where he discusses teens, parenting, and ADD. You can learn more about his writing and practice at www.dr-wes.com. That's dr-wes.com. Wes will give an introduction about the challenges of driving with ADHD and offer lots of strategies to meet them. Then he will take your questions. If you want to ask a question, type it in the Ask the Question box. So welcome, Wes. Good to have you here today.
Well, it's nice to be here, Wayne, always. And it's nice to have folks joining us for this really important topic. By way of full disclosure, I have an 18-year-old who is a bit of a reluctant ADD driver. I think she took me very seriously when I warned her about the dangers of inattentiveness, so much so that she's decided I just am not going to do it. But we're working on that. And I have a 12-year-old with ADD who is extremely excited about driving, so we're going to be starting that very early on, so he gets lots and lots of practice. So I have a personal investment in this as well as with my vast client load also. And driving, I talk about in the book how driving is a much more critical clinical question for a lot of folks with ADD than I think I ever realized it was, to the point that I really ask people in my intake sessions whether they have problems with driving and what sort of problems they have. And it's sort of funny because I will get this look of, how did you know that? Kind of like I have this magic inside vision. And it really doesn't take a lot of clinical intuition to know that. It really just takes looking at some of the statistics and to understand that we see a lot of accidents and a lot of tickets for kids and adults too with the driving situation. So it behooves us, particularly for folks with ADHD, to really think a lot about what it takes to drive safely and how to be very intentional in your driving. So in order to decide, of course not everybody with ADD and ADHD has a driving issue. So what I suggest to teens and young adults and everybody else for that matter is that they ask themselves some questions and give themselves as honest an answer as they can. And here's my little list of questions. Have I had more fender benders than most of my friends? We often think about the teen drivers, and if you work for an insurance company, believe me, you think about this a lot. We think about the teen years as a fairly dangerous time for driving, and statistically it is. So sometimes we don't notice one kid's fender benders are more than the others. I have a very good friend who I hope is not listening today. I wouldn't put it past him, but he was a high school friend that we are still friends to this day. And the running joke in our friend group was you never knew when he was going to wreck the next wheat truck or the next pickup. We lived in the country. Or the next combine. He once was loading a combine on the trailer and he took down a high power tower. And we now realize, and he is very successfully treated for ADHD. We didn't think of that back in 1978. So ask yourself, do I have more of these little mishaps, these little problems with fender benders, or hopefully not taking down high power lines, but something like that that's a minor distraction-based accident. The second one is the old trance problem. Do I drive along for miles and miles sort of in my own little world, and then all of a sudden I kind of wake back up and I don't really remember what happened the last 5 or 10 or 50 or 200 miles? That is a sign of being in a little too much internal process. And as anyone who has ADHD knows, and for most of their loved ones, you can tell that not all distractions are external. It's not like the squirrel, the proverbial squirrel that you see that attracts your attention. Sometimes the squirrel is in your head. It is what's going on inside you. And driving has this hypnotic mechanism that gets you into your head and not where you have to be behind the wheel, and that's looking at the road. A lot of times people think of focus in driving as like staring at the road and watching the white lines disappear under your car. That's not really focus in driving or anything else. Focus is when you're taking in all of the data that's going on around you, all the variables, and making moment-to-moment decisions about what to prioritize in your attention. So you notice the pedestrian more than you notice the speed, and you notice your speed more than you notice what's on the radio, and so on. You're able to pick out what is the most important thing to see right now. And if you kind of drop into a trance, you're not going to be able to do that. So if that applies to you, it's another good reason to be thinking about this webinar today. Are your friends scared to ride with you? My good friend from high school, I liked to do the driving as much as possible because I didn't want to end up in the ditch or under one of his wheat trucks. So I also helped him kind of keep track of what was going on around him. We used to call driving a team effort, and now I look back and think that's probably why I'm still alive. So if you have friends that are always like, I don't really want to ride with you, maybe that's a good indicator that you are having some inattention issues. And finally, one of my all-time favorites, wholly apart from the accidents, is the issue of not allowing yourself enough time to get where you need to be. And this is the root of speeding. And we'll talk later about GPS. One of the greatest things about a Garmin or a TomTom is that if you set it every time, it will tell you when you're supposed to arrive. And unless you're driving 300 or 400 miles, you can't really gain enough time back to change the number on that gizmo. And you begin to learn that if you have to get across town and you're late, speeding is going to gain you about a minute. And if you're that tight for time, you probably need to rethink your time management. So a lot of times not giving yourself the time you need is really kind of dangerous because it encourages speeding and running lights, running yellows, and things like that. So we will move on to the next slide. The research on this isn't extensive, but it is kind of pointed. There's a pretty well-known Swedish study of 17,000 adults with ADHD, and they found that the ADD folks had, at least in the men's group, had a 47% higher rate of accidents, and for women it was 45%. That's a pretty significant, statistically significant difference. And one of the things, and it's not worthy of debate today for folks who are pro or con on medicine, but statistically it's pretty clear from that study that taking medication, at least for guys, reduces the risk of car accidents substantially. Now, I will offer a Dr. Wessism right now about why I think that it does not show up the same way for women. On average, when you and I see thousands of hours of clients every year, and what you find is that even inattentive women tend to be anxious enough and conscientious enough to really force themselves in an almost tortured way to really attend more closely to things, sort of try to override the ADD. It's possible that accounts for the difference here because it's a fairly strong gender difference that guys were helped tremendously by medicine and women less so. So there's my theory, a little bit more anxiety on the part of women sometimes in a good way, in a helpful way. There are some earlier studies that suggested that ADHD drivers speed more frequently, as we discussed in the last slide, drive more erratically, hit the brakes at inappropriate times. I don't know if that's waking up from the trance and suddenly realizing there's a tree there. My dear friend Heather that writes the column, the blog for us for the magazine, I got a text from her one day. She was on a medicine break for the March spring break, and she wrote me a text from a parking lot, and she said, 1 minute I was in the street, and the next minute I was up on the curb, and there was a sign right in front of me. And I thought, yeah, we'll talk about medicine breaks. We are big believers in that to reduce the tolerance of medication, but for heaven's sakes, when one is off medicine for a period of time, one is at their greatest risk for accidents, and so you have to really watch yourself carefully for things like that. Okay. So really, that said, the first rule of driving for teens and for young adults, and really for anybody, is to have a very, what I would call a very close relationship with your medicine. One of the things we do in the book and in my office that we believe is a key part of the therapy for ADD is to get people to be aware, to be conscious and intentional about their bodies and how they respond to medicine. And for many folks with ADD, this is not easy because they are not as in tune with those kinds of processes. They're thinking about much more interesting things than how their body is reacting. But we try to get them to really notice that. Now, if we have listeners who are diabetic, I'm type 2 diabetic, it's a good analogy because you teach folks with diabetes to check their blood sugar before they drive, to be sure it's in a certain range, to have a little snack if they go low, because if you don't know, low blood sugar is a fairly dangerous thing when you're behind the wheel, because you can either have poor judgment or right up to the point where you would even pass out if you really go too low. So we always have people be very, very conscious about that with diabetes. The same philosophy has to really hold true for ADD. You have to know when your medicine is at its best during the day, which typically is going to be in the first 6 to 10 hours, depending on which medicine you're on. The Daytrana patch can last longer than that. Vyvanse is very long. If you're on short-acting medicine, it's a little like the diabetic and insulin. You have to be sure you know how your medicine is affecting you before you drive. Now, do I know people who have ADD who do just fine driving off their medicine? I do know those people. I don't know what makes them different. Maybe, again, there's a little anxiety there. The ADD drivers who are a little anxious seem to do better because they worry about tickets and they worry about accidents. But for some reason, some people have less trouble than others. Know thyself, as Shakespeare said, and be aware, am I in the medicine arc or am I out of it? Do I need to be in the medicine arc? Am I out of it? Watch out also for fatigue, because if you have ADD, fatigue absolutely lowers your ability to focus your attention, which is why sleep deprivation can look a lot like ADD. So being very careful about those big issues, knowing your medicine, and not driving endlessly into the night are all important things. We talked a few minutes ago about watching the white lines disappear under the car. Hyperfocus is great when you have to write a report for school and you waited to the last minute, and then you work, and magically it comes out pretty good, which then rewards you for procrastination, which isn't always a good thing. But hyperfocus is not very safe in driving, again, because the nature of driving is to take in all sorts of variables. It's multitasking. And hyperfocus is single tasking by and large. So you want to teach teenagers, and as a driver, if you are a teenager or young adult, really begin to learn to be constantly changing what you're noticing. You're scanning the environment. You're trying to take in a lot of information. What should I be thinking about? If you have younger kids, a game I like to play with my kids as they are approaching driving is, I call it, what am I thinking about right now? And so you're driving down the road and your kid is old enough now to be in the front seat with you, and you're out on the highway, let's say, or we're driving in town, and you say to the kid, look out, tell me what I'm thinking about right now. What am I interested in on the road? And they say, oh, well, there's a car slowing down up ahead. Good. Their brake lights are coming on. Good. But what about that person stepping out in front of the jaywalking area? Oh, I didn't see them. You begin to start a dialogue with the kids. Many kids actually find that kind of fun. It's almost like the license plate game. They're trying to predict what's the most important thing in traffic to consider. You can start that before they're even teenagers, and they'll think that's pretty fun. You just have to get them away from their iPad for a while to do that. So that's one of those things that helps build a broader focus, and kids begin to think of driving as this multitasking process and moves against hyperfocus. I just bought, since we made this slide a month or two ago, I just bought a new Camry that has all these voice-activated devices on it, and I had already written in our blog that these things were really dangerous. The research on them is very bad, and I know why now, because you say to them, it tells you just need to say, go to the Arby's on 23rd Street, and it says back to you, fly to Paris tomorrow night, and you're like, no, I said go to the Arby's, and it argues with you. You have this argument with your computer, and the computer always wins the argument because, it's smarter than you are, but it doesn't know anything, and so don't use these things. The closest one that works for me is I have a Garmin that I now know how to talk to, where it and I can kind of agree on some things. But in general, these things that are supposed to be helpful to pay attention to the road become so interactive with you and so frustrating that about the time you think you've won the argument, you're back up on the curb hitting the sign. So it's better to stay away from these alleged helpful instruments. Pull over to a parking lot, set your Garmin, set your TomTom, set your navigation control. My Camry thankfully won't let me set it unless I am standing still, and that's a pretty good, you can't even override it. That's a pretty good tool. Talking on the phone, for the longest time we thought that was preferable. And there's some evidence now, brand new research in the last week or two, particularly with teenagers, that almost anything, including having more than one other person in the car with you, creates distraction. For folks with ADD, filtering out that distraction is, of course, exactly what ADD is about. So things like eating messy food. There are foods you just don't eat. Pizza. Have you ever tried to eat pizza in a car? It's like a terrible idea. There are certain small burritos that are pretty easy to eat, but everything else, hamburgers, hot dogs, all this stuff that people try to eat in their car are so difficult to manage, they take focus off of the primary task, which is, of course, driving. Fiddling with your iPad or your dash, I have this dash computer, that's why it doesn't let me operate it. And the worst thing of all is texting. And again, they've come up with this new idea for most of these new navigation systems that I can just talk to the computer and it will text for me. That doesn't help. It's not just the looking at the screen. It is the process of having to create the text that mentally takes you out of the driving experience. So kids, because all kids, whether they have ADD or not, are thinking about the next thing that's about to happen. And rather than integrating that into the whole driving experience and thinking, by talking on this device, I'm not paying attention, they're just focused on talking to the cute guy or girl that just texted them, and if they don't, in today's society, if you don't text somebody back in about 20 seconds, you've broken up. So you if you're going to do that, if it's that important, pull over. And talking to kids about this, again, when they're preteens and on through their teen years, makes it easier for them to see how serious that is. The one thing that doesn't work with kids, it never works, it doesn't work with sex, it doesn't work with texting, it doesn't work with anything, is just scaring them. If you just scare them all the time, they're just not going to listen to you. And so have a rational discussion with them about why texting and driving or eating hot dogs and driving or whatever is going to raise their risk of an accident, and try to talk about the physical consequences of that, which are going to be, you're going to park the car if it's still running. I try to do this, and I get a small number of people to do it. The best place for your smartphone is in the trunk. Try and lock it in the trunk. And if you can do that, the risk of your kid having an accident goes down dramatically. So the next thing I think people struggle with, particularly the folks with ADD, but everybody who drives, is you get in the car and you're so excited to get where you're going, and maybe you're late, and you start driving, and then you're buckling your seatbelt while you're driving, and you've got to get makeup on, or you've got to adjust your glasses or put in eye drops or whatever you're going to do. This is really something to try to teach kids not to do. If you do meditation, some of the simplest meditations are sitting there thinking, what am I doing right now? What am I about to do? Do I have what I need? And if you can get kids to do that in life, they are more able to be conscious of themselves and to have the things they need and to be ready to do what they need to do. Nowhere is that more important than in driving. So I try to teach kids, get in the car, put on your seatbelt, maybe, walk around the car, those kind of things. Put on your seatbelt and think, what am I doing right now? And you just sit there for a second. It's going to kill all of 5-10 seconds. It's not a difficult task. Is everything the way it's supposed to be? Are my mirrors where they belong? Do I know where I'm going? Did I set my GPS? And then they can go. There are a number of other things, but those are some examples that you want to consider. The more kids can do that, the more safe they're going to be when they start out, doing more things up front. And you got other things like the heater. People will fool with that heating control forever. And the minute your eyes are down low, they're not on the road. All right. Now, we shall now speak of the issue of cruise control. And I looked at some of the comments on our article, and I got to say those were some pretty, if people want to go back to our blog and see some of the things, folks, or I guess it maybe was the article in the magazine, people had some pretty good comments, and I'm going to integrate some of what they were trying to teach. And I have two schools of thought now about this. I am a big believer in cruise control for one reason, and that is because it is much harder to get a ticket if you set yourself right on the speed limit. And I think if you can use it, we have some roads in our town that are pretty wide open roads, but they're only like 40-mile-an-hour roads. And those are the ones that will sneak up on you every time because you just don't feel like you should be going that slow. And by setting cruise control obsessively in those situations, you will prevent yourself from easing up to the 50 to 60-mile-an-hour speed zone and not realizing you're there. That it is so difficult to be conscious of speed that I just don't know how to teach people to do it. Now here is the other side of the coin that people brought up with the blog or with the article. You can induce that road trance that I was talking about by using cruise control. I remember way back, I am old enough to remember when cruise control first came out. And the big fear when it first came out or became popular was that people would have that malaise on the road, that their foot is not having to do this thing with the gas pedal that keeps you kind of awake and conscious, and that people would just drive off into the ditch. That didn't turn out to be true, but for people with ADD, they were identifying on the article comments that they had struggled with this, and that if they didn't have that movement, one person actually said they use a manual transmission in order to keep all that movement going so they're focused and attentive. So I will modify my recommendation on this and say, again, know thyself. If you go into a trance when you're using cruise control, that's probably not a safe bet. But if you are going to consistently get tickets on the highway not using it, you have a tough dilemma. It's better to get a bunch of tickets than to wreck your car on the highway at 70 miles an hour. But it is really a tough balance between those two things. And if you are having that much trouble staying focused, driving may be a pretty dangerous pursuit. Some of the folks that made comments really talked about how scary their driving was, and I empathize with them. We've talked quite a bit about GPS. I think using it wisely is pretty important. Letting it tell you how long it's going to take you to be somewhere is pretty important. But I wrote this before I heard a recent NPR story where they were talking about some of the problems of GPS, and one of them is that nobody knows how to use maps anymore. And so if you don't have a command of the area, you may end up off in the lost. My new navigation system on my Camry is terrible. It goes all sorts of places I know aren't right. So if you're out somewhere you don't know where you are, get a reality check before you end up lost. And then earlier I said that my friend and I used to consider driving a team sport. I think having a co-pilot is a pretty good idea if you have ADD. As long as you learn to work well together. Now, for young people, this is very upsetting because the co-pilot of the parent, depending on how calm the parent is, and you got to be really calm to ride around with teenagers, it becomes a sort of a feeling of control and domination. That's not what we're looking for. The parent really has to take a deep breath and maybe, I don't know, a Xanax or something to be able to be in a calm, reflective state and still give strong instruction when needed. So go gently in that situation, but if you're a teenager listening or a parent wants to pass this advice on, try not to take that personally, because usually that's designed to help keep you focused and on the road, and there's a lot of evidence that if people are consistently staying engaged with each other in it focused on driving, it helps. If you're just talking about stuff randomly, that's not as helpful. Also, things like watching for changes in speed limit. One of the great things about GPS, as long as you keep it updated, is it will tell you when your speed limit changes, and mine even turns red when I'm over the speed limit. It has a pretty clear red sign on it. And if you don't have that, a friend can be very helpful in keeping an eye on that sort of thing. Too much of the time now, the friend is in the passenger seat texting somebody, and it's better if people can both be alert and keeping an eye on the road. All right. I'm hoping with our group today that we have some questions that I can be helpful in answering about the topic of driving. There's plenty to discuss on this.
Lots of questions from concerned parents, Wes, so I'll start with this one. Before my teen starts to drive, do you think it's a good idea to make an appointment with a doctor to make sure his medication is at the right dosage and to find out if he has any visual challenges before hitting the road?
Yes, absolutely, on both counts. Everybody should probably have the eye exam before they drive for obvious reasons. One time my daughter, I had perfect vision until I was about 42, and my son has perfect vision. My wife and my daughter don't, and we were in Washington, D.C. My daughter was probably 9 at the time, and I was trying to teach her how the the street signs work in Washington. You know, you have the letter street signs that go north. And I was showing her this, and she's like, I don't see it, Daddy. And I said, what don't you see, the words on the street sign? She goes, no, I don't see the street signs. And I said, what? And they're right there. She says, I don't see them. Oh, my gosh, her prescription had deteriorated so much, and she didn't think about it. And while older kids that are driving age will notice that more, don't take anything for granted. Very critical. But in terms of the medicine, it is, I got to tell you, it's going to bother some people, but I think parents have to really question if a young person is refusing medication management and they have any history at all of these kind of accidents, the things that were on my list earlier. I think parents have to question whether it's a good idea to turn a giant four-wheeled box of metal over to their child. If the kid has ADD, doesn't want to do medicine, and isn't having any kind of driving problems at all, then maybe that's a different question. But I think the research is clear enough, and my clinical experience is clear enough, that medicine, ADD, and driving all have to go together. So I totally endorse that point about the doctor.
Another parent asks, my 16-year-old son wants his driving permit badly, but he is highly impulsive and has very bad temper tantrums. I worry that if someone cuts him off, he will lose it and possibly start driving recklessly. I've heard that people with ADHD and ODD shouldn't be driving. How do I handle this with him, and do you have a general feeling about ODD and ADHD on the road?
I think that was your son that pulled up behind me and then flipped me off and jumped into the left lane on a draw in a no passing zone and went around me at 80 the other day, and I turned him into the cops. Was that him? I'm sure that it's his cousin. This is a problem on the road, and I think you ask a very good question, the answer to which is it's very hard to know case to case. People who have a lot of rage issues and a lot of impulse control, I would just ask everybody listening, do you want to be out on the road with that person? And I think parents have an obligation to make sure kids are safe in those situations. Now, here is how I would go about trying to improve his safety over the course of time. So item one, we all probably understand that on average, I think it was Barkley who first kind of realized this, but it's pretty well held now, that kids are about 2.5 years behind their peer group in maturity. And I can attest to that for many of the clients I see. Not all of them, but many. So if a person's emotional maturity at 16 is more like probably that person isn't as ready to drive. So you just have to assess your child for that. The correct solution to that is to tell them that if they are interested in driving, they are going to have a much longer supervised driving period. So I would say that at the first time they can get a learner's permit, you want to go ahead and start driving with them. And you want to do that maybe for 3 or 4 years. Not sign off on the restricted. Now, I'm giving a very generalized statement. Some people are going to do better than others in this regard. And as you this gives you a tremendous amount of time to really observe the child's driving and how they handle the kinds of situations if they pass me and flip me off or whatever they're going to do, and to intervene in that again and again and again. And as all of us who've parented kids with ADD know, there's a lot of repetition. You've got to do this for a while. The other advantage to that is by the time they get to be 17 or 18, approximately maturity level is going to be about 16, 16 and a half, and you now have given them a longer period of time to where they hopefully will be more emotionally together and safer on the road. So in general, I would support your supposition that maybe you need to slow down this young person's trip to the highway. And he's going to hate you for that, and that's just the way it goes.
Do you have any philosophy or strategy about having friends in the car, especially after the first after the first several months of a person getting his or her license, a parent asks, her daughter has some friends in the car, they watch videos, they play music loudly, which makes for less attention being paid to the roads by her daughter.
Yeah.
A friend of her daughter's actually got into a very serious car accident when she was changing a CD. What kind of rules should I institute about driving with friends, or should I just make her wait for a while before she can actually have friends in the car?
I think that second idea isn't a bad one. I'm not kidding when I say that's what's great about pickup trucks. I grew up in western Kansas, and we all had pickup trucks. And this is before they had very many extend cabs on the road. And so you could just barely get 3 people in the pickup, and it wasn't very comfortable. And that was a great idea, especially the little trucks. Everybody loved those little Toyota 4x4s, and that's the perfect truck because you can really only get one other person in there, or fairly small cars that don't have much of a back seat. Back in that day, Camaros didn't have much of a back seat. I don't know what they have now. So the fewer spaces there are, the better. People who get their kids these big cars with lots of space, people will be like, oh, you can just drive my minivan. And, A, that's not the coolest car for a teenager to drive. And B, it has like 6 seats. And you get kids loading up a bunch of kids, and it's a bad idea. So starting with thinking about the vehicle, and you also want vehicles that are well crash tested and have side airbags and all that stuff, and then get the smallest amount of space in the car that you can. And then the idea that you want to have a delay on when kids can drive with their friends is a great idea. And I would tell you the golden age for that is 17 or 18 or something, except it just depends from one child to the other. I completely have teenagers I see who they have this friend they talk about, and they're scared to death to ride with her, and I tell them then don't go. But if you're going to be a helpful teen in the car, I think that's fine, but too often it's exactly as you described, playing loud music and dancing and whatever else they do. So I think you have to really try to keep it down to as small a dance floor as you can get in a car.
Mary has a good question. Actually, several parents have asked this. My son will be 18 in June. He has ADHD. He has not driven at all. He does not want to take driver's ed. He thinks he can just walk into the Motor Vehicle Bureau, take the test, and get his license. He doesn't seem to have any interest in learning the rules of the road. How do I get through to him?
Yep, this is such a pain, and it extends to issues other than driving. You remember our last webinar, I said that there's like 3 different kinds of young adults, and there's the overly optimistic and the scared to death and the kind of confused and disoriented ones. This is the same situation. This kid is too optimistic. And I think this is where you have to go to a power intervention. And you tell him, there is no conceivable way I am going to cover you on my insurance for you driving at this point. And I'm not going to put $1 into a car for you. I'm not going to support this. If you want to go out and pay $1,000 a month, which is probably not far off, for full coverage insurance on a car as an 18-year-old new driver with no experience, and you can find an insurance company dumb enough to go along with that, I cannot stand in your way. But I will not enable that when it is an unwise decision. And reasoning with a young person is very important. People say, it's because I said so. That's not a very good teaching strategy. But in this case, if the young person does not understand why what you just described is a bad idea, you're just going to have to lock down and say, I won't do it. And, there's not too many other ways around it. Then tell them, if you want to drive, you're going to have to go to driving school and, pay for it. You can pay for it. Take defensive driving courses, which I hadn't mentioned yet, are very helpful. Teaching you how to prepare for the worst of everything on the road. They have driving simulators now that are fun and also pretty helpful. And if he didn't want to do any of that, I think bikes are great. They're less expensive and don't break down as much. Maybe he needs to aim in that direction.
A lot of parents ask, do you have any strategies or advice for getting my daughter to wear her seatbelt every time she gets in the car? How do I get through to her? That's a tough one.
The great thing about this is that when you tell them, wow, look at all the dead people who didn't wear their seatbelt, they tell you, oh no, I knew this person. I saw on the internet, I saw on Twitter that this person wore her seatbelt and that's what killed her. This is like an urban legend. And if you get 25,000 people's lives saved from wearing seatbelts and 2 people die because they were in a burning car and couldn't get their seatbelt off, kids will go to the 2 people who had that happen and use that as their metric. This is such a standard sort of teenager thing. They do this with marijuana, they do it with drinking, they do it with everything, with sex. They pick out the best case scenario to support their position. This is tricky because you have to decide, well, you have to decide how hard you're willing to fight this. And it's actually interesting. I don't know very many teenagers who don't wear seatbelts, believe it or not. I know what they do, and they are pretty adamant about this. They've gotten that in their heads. So your kid is actually kind of going against the grain. What I would do is get the most, the safest car you can get. And it's not hard to do now. Every airbag there ever was in a car, and I would then, because that's what those are for. You understand airbags are only there because people don't wear seatbelts. And then I would show them a few pictures of what happens with an airbag deployment when a person isn't wearing their seatbelt, which is their face is like burnt from the bag hitting them. And that may do it. The kid may say, oh, wow, I don't want my face to get impacted by this airbag, just because that's what airbags do. They explode in your face and they save your life, but they're kind of painful. And so if a person wears their seatbelt, the airbag does a lot less damage to them. It's a passive restraint. It's there as your last resort. So you might have some luck with that strategy, but that kid isn't going to wear her seatbelt. She needs to be in the safest car you can get your hands on.
This question is about a daughter who failed the road test 4 times. The last 2 times because she hit a cone while parallel parking. This parent says, secretly, I am happy I can postpone the day that she starts driving.
I bet you are.
But I know this is affecting her esteem and confidence as a driver. What can I do?
I really appreciate that question because the parent is showing such sensitivity to the child and also, being not like being a pushover. I really appreciate it because I had the same reaction. I thought, this poor kid, imagine how humiliating this is. So I think that I'm not sure whether the child doesn't have a permit or they can't get their full license. If they can't get a permit, they usually don't have to drive to get a permit. So I'm assuming they are doing some practice driving. And I would just suggest to the kid that everybody learns at a different rate, that you're going to be there with them and drive more and more and more and more, and use that as an excuse to get them as many hours of driving practice as possible. My family, and me and my family are the least ADD people ever. I don't know what happened with my kids. We had some genetic, like skipping the generation. But I was driving when I was 13 years of age, and by the time I was 14, I was driving with my parents in Dallas, Texas, in the middle of the city. So I was taught very early on to have hundreds of hours of experience in driving before I ever took off on my own. And by the time I was 16, my parents gave me the car, and I drove across Kansas by myself. It was enough experience at that point that I did fine. So that will work with your daughter. She just needs about 5 times as much driving practice as anybody else, and you just have to break that to her gently and say, it's okay, we're going to get you through this, but let's just keep at it. And do just as you suggested, as the writer suggests, to understand how hard this must be for her to feel so defeated. And I'm with you on being happy that she isn't getting on the road any sooner than possible, but I also feel bad for her.
Larry wants to know, is there an objective test, and he puts test in quotations, to know when your teenage daughter with ADHD is ready to start driving?
Wouldn't that be great? We could plug the USB drive into her head. I'll tell you the closest thing I know to that. Excuse me. I'll tell you the closest thing I know to that, and I don't have an experience with it. I just know it exists. There are driving simulator systems that I think driving schools, particularly in larger cities, have, that really do an objective rating, and so you're doing all these things in like a video game, and this way when you kill the pedestrian they come back to life and it's not a felony, and you're getting this experience in a much safer environment, and it will really give a pretty objective measure. And my assumption about that is it translates, insurance companies love this kind of thing, it'll translate well enough to the real world that if your child is having a really hard time with the fake pedestrian and the fake cones and the fake pet that comes out in the road and all these things they throw at you in the driving experience, if she's having a hard enough time with that, it's probably a good analog for the problem she's really going to have on the road. So that is my best answer to that. It's really a good question, and I think if I were a parent facing that right at the moment, and especially in the city, I would be looking for these driving simulators.
Mm-hmm. Another parent asks, what do you think of drawing up a driving contract with my son, who just got his license? He agrees to follow driving rules and regulations. I have the right to confiscate the keys when he breaks them. Can a parent actually make this work with a teen?
Absolutely they can. The question is, will you? And I would give you one warning on that. Do not write any checks you are not willing to cash. If you write that contract up and say, this is I'm investing in your driving, here's what I'm putting up to do that, insurance, money for the car, whatever, maybe you're putting the gas in, this is my role, this is your role, and here is what you are able to do with the car, and you make your list as you see fit, and you say, if you violate these rules, and maybe you have a metric, like if you violate the eating a hot dog in the car, I'm going to do this. If you violate having 8 people in the car, I'm going to do this, and make it more problematic for them the more troublesome they are. Then you follow through without question. Great. What happens too often is people like writing contracts, they don't like enforcing them. And so the first time you come back and don't follow through with the reasonable, well thought out consequence in the contract, then the kid is like, yeah, they were just kidding. And that's worse than no contract at all. So I think that's a great idea. If you really have situations where a kid has violated that contract and you need to have them driving for some reason, like school or something, it is not very difficult at this point to track people and their driving using GPS systems and such. And I do not recommend that unless you have probable cause to believe that they are doing things they shouldn't be doing, or speeding a lot, or doing dangerous things. And even insurance companies at one point had systems set up that you could track your kids' driving habits. And if that's necessary for their safety, I think that you should look into it.
This parent says, I am an optimist, but what happens if my teen gets into an accident or is caught speeding? What's the best way to teach him what to do if a police officer stops him, or he is at an accident scene, or his car breaks down even in the middle of the night? This is not part really of passing the road test at a motor vehicle agency. What's the best way to prep him?
It's such a good question, and not one I would have thought of. I'm just impressed that this parent has teenagers and they're still an optimist. That's impressive to me. No, I think that's great. So to me, if you go back to what I said about the little game, what am I thinking right now, as you're driving around with kids and they're riding with you or you're having lunch, you're just in some sort of informal setting, this is always the best way to talk with kids. If you have like a whiteboard and you say, okay, kids, line up. We're going to have how to get out of a car accident time. They're not going to be as interested than as if you are just talking about it kind of naturally. Or maybe they come in and they say, oh my gosh, my friend got pulled over in a traffic stop and got arrested last night. There's a good opportunity to say, wow, what do you think you ought to do in a situation like that? And really begin that dialogue so they're sort of thinking about it when it happens. Now, you actually asked about 4 or 5 completely different scenarios. And for anybody who's a minor, if they get pulled over for any infraction, there are two parts to this, the crime and punishment part and the due process part. And parents get really confused about those two issues. So the due process part is parents need to be sure that kids are treated fairly under the law. And in general, that's not the job of law enforcement. Their job is not to be sure your child is treated fairly. Their job is to shake your kid down if they've committed, or to find out if they've committed an offense. So kids must be taught in school, in any kind of situation, that when an officer is wanting to question them, they need to not respond without counsel. We see this all the time. I don't know what it's like in other people's worlds, but you have what's called a resource officer in the school. And people forget that's not officer friendly because they see the person every day and they're best friends with them. It is an officer. It is a law enforcement officer. And if you tell them, well, yeah, I do have a bag of weed in my car, you've just confessed to a crime. And kids forget this, and law enforcement will take advantage of that because it's their job. That's what they do, is to investigate crime. So kids need to understand due process. The other side of that is if kids are violating the law and knowingly doing so and violating your rules with the car, let's say they get a minor in possession or a DUI or something, I think parents need to not just save the child. They need to be sure the child has due process and then let the child suffer in that situation, because what we see in our neck of the woods, and I'm in a university town, fairly affluent town, and my Kansas City practice is in a very affluent part of town, parents will rush in, hire the best attorney in town, and do everything they can think of to bail their child out of legal consequence. And I don't think I need to explain how that turns out. Kids feel enabled to go do more of the same. So due process, but also don't save them. And kids need to be taught that up front so they understand, if you get into legal trouble with the car, here's what I'm willing to do and here's what I won't do. I may not bail you out of jail that night. You may be sitting in juvenile detention, or if you're an adult, sitting in jail. That is a sobering effect, literally and figuratively, on kids. So go through all of these. You talked about also scenarios with breakdowns. Have kids in their phone, have the AAA number or whatever they need to do to call, because when that happens, kids' anxiety goes up and their reasoning goes down, and they don't have a procedure to follow. If they have a breakdown or they're somewhere that they don't know how to handle it, be sure that you've walked them through that in careful detail. There are all sorts of those kind of scenarios that you can just have a dialogue about, and it'll help when the kids need it.
Yeah, one parent actually had a practical suggestion of putting all these scenarios in and writing them up on index cards and putting them in the glove compartment. Thought that wasn't a bad idea.
Yeah, I think it's a great idea. And you can also, if you want to follow kid technology, you can also plug all of that material into the Notes app on their phone or whatever tool they like to use, so it's always with them. They have all those numbers and everything they need, but it's a super idea to put it in the glove compartment too.
Yeah, I hadn't heard about this, but there's something called graduated licensing. A teen receives a provisional license to drive with specific restrictions. The restrictions are lifted systematically as the driver gains experience and demonstrates competence. Have any of your clients used this type of licensing, and what do you think?
So we don't have that in Kansas. It's been discussed. We don't have it exactly the way that was described. We have a system where you have the permit, the restricted license, and the full license. What this is about is an even more incremental movement. There are states that do that. What parents can do in states that don't have that is to create the same system in their own home. Like that thing the person asked about earlier, when as a kid should a kid be allowed to have friends in the car? Maybe that's after they have hit, you know, X number of independent driving hours. Parents can set up that graduated system, and they might even want to look at some of the states that have that. I can't name any off the top of my head. I feel like California has that, and see what they do, what they actually have codified in there. And I think it's interesting because, as everyone probably knows, all traffic safety laws are driven by insurance companies and the insurance lobbies because they're trying to lower their risk management and the risk exposure. And that sounds like one of those things insurance companies probably like quite a bit and lobby for. And I think it's one of those areas that parents would be very much in alignment with to try to have that graduated system.
Mm-hmm. This one's actually from a teen. It's sort of addressing that trance concept that you talked about, but he asks, the longer I drive, the more the scenery starts to look the same on the highway. Trees turn to green blurs, cars seem to stand still since we are all sort of going the same speed. This is when I really worry that something bad is going to happen. What should I do when I get into this state?
Yeah, keep on worrying, brother. That's a very, very insightful comment. So the first, and it seems obvious, but it isn't always until the moment it comes, solution to that is you need to hit the rest stop. If you're out on the highway, on an interstate, there's going to be a rest stop. Your Garmin or TomTom or whatever will tell you how far it is, and that's what they're there for, is for you to pull over, get up, walk around, do a little stretch, whatever helps. And you may, as a person with ADD, need to do that more frequently than other people. Just plan that into your time. Part of it depends on how long it takes for that to kick in. If that's something that kicks in every 10 minutes, you're going to have to do some kind of a system. One possibility is to plug into your iTunes or whatever you use, something that kind of reminds you to wake up every 5 minutes. It's a little tricky to do, but you can create, kids can create audio files pretty easily nowadays. And if you have something like that that's sort of reminding you, are you on task, that would be, for a severe case, something you could do. You sort of need something that like gives you an electrical shock every 8 minutes and you realize, hey, I'm back in it. But taking the break, the driving break, and I should have actually put that in the slides. I'm really glad that it came up here. Taking a driving break is something people just don't do enough of, whether they have ADD or not. And it's crucial in maintaining focus on the road.
Mm-hmm. Here's a question. My daughter doesn't do well on ADHD medications, so she doesn't take it. We have her using alternative treatments to manage symptoms. Does that mean I shouldn't allow her to drive?
Well, I will answer that. That is a complex question, so let me answer the first part. The idea of not doing well on medicine is an area of some interest to me. Without plumbing the depths of that case, our experience is that if we keep working at it with a closely integrated relationship, we have our own prescriber now at our office, and if we work very closely together and the kid is on the team and we're on the team and we work on some of the thinking styles around medicine, ultimately we will find a medicine that is helpful. Now, if that absolutely isn't the case, the first thing you must do is question the diagnosis. It is entirely possible that that is the wrong diagnosis. Now, if the alternative treatments, and I don't know which they are because there are many, if the alternative treatments aren't solving the problem in such a way as concentration and focus improve, then driving is only one of your problems. And I would suggest that if everything else is right, driving will come in place. Like if you're okay and doing well in school, able to focus, able to do homework, able to manage yourself and your time and all that stuff, whatever treatment you're using, driving should be there. It should be okay. If it's not, then it's a symptom of not having the ADHD controlled. So that's the best I can do with a complicated question. But I wouldn't just say no, she can't drive, because if you're really treating it successfully, then it ought to be okay.
Mm-hmm. Well, that'll have to be the last question. We're about at 2 o'clock. So I wanted to thank you again, Wes, for giving us some practical strategies for keeping our kids safe behind the wheel. We all appreciate it.
And it was good to have everybody join us. Had a very good group and such wonderful questions. It's nice to always have a challenging discussion.
Mm-hmm. Well, we'll see everyone next week at Attitude's next webinar. Have a good day.